One decision at Waterloo reshaped Europe's destiny forever. On June 2 Delapan 1815, two of history's greatest commanders faced each other with everything at stake. Wellington commanded a coalition army of 100,000 men. The Duke of Wellington stood firm, knowing his career, reputation, and the future of Europe depended on this single battle. He had spent years building his defensive position. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France, believed his genius would once again overcome superior numbers. He had never lost a major battle when commanding in person. Wellington chose to defend the strategic ridge at Mont Saint-Jean, creating a natural fortress. Napoleon planned to break through the center with his elite imperial guard. The statistical odds favored Wellington, with his defensive position and reinforcements, yet history records that Napoleon had never been defeated when leading from the front. As the afternoon wore on, both commanders made fateful decisions. Wellington held his position, refusing to commit his reserves too early. Napoleon delayed his final assault. Napoleon's victory at Waterloo would have shattered the fragile peace of 1815. Plunging Europe into immediate chaos, the Congress of Vienna's carefully crafted balance of power would collapse overnight, leaving a power vacuum. Prussia, humiliated and defeated, would face dismemberment. Its eastern provinces would be annexed by a vengeful France. Austria would lose its Italian possessions, while the Confederation of the Rhine would expand, swallowing smaller German states. The British army, shattered at Waterloo, would retreat to the coast. A French invasion of England suddenly seemed plausible, but a Napoleonic victory came with hidden costs. His empire was overstretched, financially drained, and reliant on conscription. The continental system, designed to cripple Britain, had already backfired. A victorious Napoleon would inherit a broken economy. Resistance would fester in Spain, where guerrilla warfare had bled the French army for years. It would not stop. Russia, though defeated in 1812, would rebuild its army. A French-dominated Europe would face a new Eastern threat. The unintended consequence: a new, unstable continental empire. Napoleon's rule would breed resentment and rebellion. Nationalism, which Napoleon had inadvertently sparked, would now turn against him. Germany and Italy would seek unification. The immediate chaos would force the great powers into a new, fragile alliance. The war would not end at Waterloo. Europe would enter a decade of war, not peace. The dream of a stable French empire was an illusion from the start. This is just the beginning. Subscribe to see more amazing content. Fire. The final cannon fired at Waterloo would echo across Europe for generations to come. Had Napoleon won, the entire continent would have followed a vastly different path. Royal families trembled at the thought of French dominance. Dynasties that seemed secure would have crumbled under Napoleonic influence. The balance of power, carefully constructed after years of war, would have collapsed entirely. The House of Hanover, ruling Britain, would have faced an existential crisis. Without Wellington's victory, their claim to the throne might have been challenged. Meanwhile, the Habsburg Empire would have collapsed without the hope of British support. The Austrian aristocracy, already weakened, would have been swept aside by French revolutionary fervor. The very concept of monarchy itself would have been questioned across Central Europe. The Romanov dynasty in Russia would have faced a different kind of pressure. With Napoleon triumphant in the West, Tsar Alexander's reforms would have been forced in a radical direction. The conservative elements of Russian society would have been crushed by the ideological tide. The serfs, already restless, might have found their path to emancipation dramatically altered. The entire social fabric of the Russian Empire would have been transformed. The ideology of revolution would have spread unchecked throughout Europe. Napoleon's victory would have validated the principles of the French Revolution across the continent. The conservative order that emerged after 1815 would have been replaced by a new Napoleonic empire. The Congress of Vienna's carefully crafted balance would have been shattered. The very definition of sovereignty would have been reimagined in Paris. The suppression of traditional monarchies would have created a power vacuum. New political movements would have emerged to fill the void left by the old order. The liberal movements that would later dominate the Satu-Sembilan century might have been accelerated by decades. The very concept of nationalism would have taken a different form under Napoleonic influence. The cultural identity of Europe would have been fundamentally transformed. The cultural development of Europe would have taken a dramatically different path. The Romantic movement, influenced by the Napoleonic legend, would have flourished in new directions. The arts and literature of the continent would have been shaped by the triumphant revolutionary spirit. The architectural styles of the period would have reflected the grandeur of the new empire. The very soul of European civilization would have been altered. The social structures of Europe would have been completely reconfigured. The aristocracy that had dominated for centuries would have been replaced by a meritocratic system. The middle class, already growing, would have found new avenues for advancement. The working class might have achieved emancipation decades earlier than in our timeline. The entire social hierarchy would have been turned upside down. The Industrial Revolution might have taken a different trajectory as well. With Napoleon's vision of a unified Europe, trade barriers would have been eliminated decades earlier. The spread of technological innovations would have accelerated across the continent. The economic centers of power would have shifted dramatically. The very nature of capitalism would have been transformed by Napoleonic economic policies. The educational systems across Europe would have been revolutionized. Napoleon's emphasis on meritocracy would have transformed universities and schools. The curriculum would have been redesigned to reflect revolutionary principles. Literacy rates would have increased dramatically across the continent. The very way knowledge was transmitted would have been fundamentally altered by the new order. The religious landscape of Europe would have been dramatically reshaped as well. The concordat with the Catholic Church might have evolved into a more secular arrangement. Protestant movements would have found new avenues for expansion. The relationship between church and state would have been fundamentally altered. The very role of religion in public life would have been transformed by Napoleonic influence. Victory at Waterloo would have handed Napoleon the keys to a global empire. But what kind of world would that empire have built? The first casualty of a French victory would be British naval supremacy. Without Wellington's triumph, the Royal Navy's dominance would face a continental blockade. Britain would be isolated, its trade routes choked. The empire that once ruled the waves would become a besieged island, fighting for survival. Meanwhile, Russia would face a resurgent France on its western border. The Tsar's army, once the savior of Europe, would now confront a vengeful emperor. Napoleon's continental system would finally succeed. European markets would be closed to British goods, strangling the Industrial Revolution across the Channel. But a French-dominated Europe would not be peaceful. The conquered states would simmer with resentment, and nationalism would become a weapon against the empire. Spain would erupt in guerrilla warfare again, this time without British support. The Peninsular War would become a quagmire, bleeding French resources dry. In the Americas, without British naval protection, the fledgling United States would face a hostile French sphere. The Monroe Doctrine would be dead on arrival. The slave trade might have persisted longer under French influence. Napoleon's 1802 reinstatement of slavery in French colonies would set a dark precedent. Yet, the Napoleonic Code would spread across Europe, unifying legal systems. The ideals of meritocracy and secular law might take root more deeply. But this new world order would be built on constant war. Napoleon's empire, like all empires, would eventually crumble under its own weight. The world we know would be unrecognizable. A French victory at Waterloo would not just change borders. It would rewrite the story of humanity itself. History rests on a single moment's choice. A fragile thread holds all worlds. One wrong step changes everything forever. The past is never truly settled. What if we could rewrite that moment? The weight of possibilities is immense. Every choice creates ripples across time. The past echoes in our present. Free will or predetermined fate. The debate echoes through history. The past cannot be changed, but understanding it changes us. Small decisions create massive realities. The human cost is always high. History is not just dates and battles. It is human lives forever altered. Alternate realities exist only in thought. The real cost is in our choices. The past shapes our future, but we shape how we remember it. Every path not taken still exists somewhere. In the space between worlds, the complexity of history is its greatest lesson. Nothing is simple. Understanding the past doesn't change it, but it changes us. The human cost of alternate realities is always measured in lives. History is woven from countless threads. Hi everyone. Quick reminder. Subscribe for high-quality daily content. Sparkle's Last Chance. Subscribe now before we launch our new series. Unlocked.